welcome to the Washington Farm Bureau Update, a podcast designed to provide the latest agriculture, legislative, and Farm Bureau information. Hey there, everyone. Ben Tyndall here, and today's podcast is going to be a conversation with Farm Bureau's Rick Gastelum, as well as with Cristina Rodriguez and Ellen Saline of Labor and Industry's Employment Standards program. We're going to talk about the new requirements that ag employers are now looking at due to some of the work accomplished by the Washington legislature this past session. If you're an agriculture employer in particular, this is a conversation that you're going to want to listen to.
So as far as the agricultural overtime bill that passed, the statute itself provides a pretty good framework for making sure that agricultural workers are eligible for overtime pay. But there's a lot of questions that come along with that. And that's what our administrative policies kind of aim to do. We try and help answer the questions that arise from new laws.
We really just want to emphasize that L&I is here to help, and we want to ensure that the public has the information that they need to remain in compliance and stay informed with these changing wage and hour laws. And please feel free to reach out to the Department of Labor and Industry's Employment Standards program if you have any questions related to agricultural overtime changes with these new laws.
All right. Well, I am joined here at the microphone with Farm Bureau's own CFO, Rick Gastelum. Rick, as always, thanks for being a part of today's podcast. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah, good morning, Ben. Thanks for having me on today.
Well, we've got Cristina Rodriguez and Ellen Saline of L&I's Employment Standards program online with us, and I'll turn it over to them in just a moment. But Rick, first, tee this up for us and talk a little bit about today's conversation, would you?
Yeah, sure. So for almost a year now, we have been working on an outreach program supported by Labor and Industries to help get the word out to small businesses in the ag community about labor laws that they need to be aware of, the various employment standards, rest meals, breaks, paid sick leave. And so we've been doing a big educational push over the last year. We had some in-person 2-day workshops that started last winter and went all the way through this April. It was our Agricultural Boot Camp 3, and that was surrounding how to develop your own in-house strategic HR risk management plan, human resources risk management plan, because we know Washington State is very ag labor intensive, a lot of ag employees working for these ag businesses, and there are just volumes of laws and rules that these businesses need to make sure they're complying with. We also want to help make sure workers' rights are being protected. Right. And so this educational effort that we worked on with Labor and Industries was to help get the word out about that. And so this podcast that we're doing today is sort of kind of puts a nice little bow on that project as we're wrapping it up. It finishes up here June 30th with the big focus on ag labor in our legislative session. Right. We thought it was great to reach out to the department and see if there were some key staff available that could help sort of talk about what sort of hot topics came out of that legislative session and how that may impact the agricultural industry. So that's what we're doing here today.
Perfect. And we're grateful to have both Cristina and Ellen joining us today. Ladies, thank you both for being a part of today's podcast. If you would, start us off with some introductions. Tell us about your role with the agency and what is L&I's Employment Standards program?
Sure thing. Well, thanks so much for having us, first of all. My name is Ellen Saline, and I'm a policy analyst in the Employment Standards program. So in this particular role, I get to oversee a variety of rulemaking projects, policy development efforts, and I also get to help with implementing new laws and regulations as they relate to workplace rights. And so we're going to talk about some of those new laws today. So thank you so much for having us. As kind of a background of what the Employment Standards program does is we enforce a wide variety of workplace rights. So those include things such as wage and hour laws, paid sick leave, other protected leave laws. We enforce youth employment regulations. So if you're going to hire minors, There are separate regulations you need to be aware of. We also enforce the Equal Pay and Opportunities Act, which is the state's new gender pay equality law. We also enforce isolated worker protections as well as agricultural labor standards.
Great. And Cristina, how about yourself?
Yeah, so I'm Cristina Rodriguez, and also I'm really happy to be here. Thanks, Washington Farm Bureau, for inviting us to do this podcast. So I'm Cristina, and I'm the Agricultural Employment Specialist with the Employment Standards Program. I'm part of the Farm Labor Unit, which does a variety of work regarding agricultural wage and hour laws. And some of this includes administering the farm labor contracting licensing system, as well as ensuring statewide compliance. We also provide technical guidance on agricultural employment laws, and we administer the farm internship program. And one thing that I really like about this job is we provide bilingual education outreach services for the agricultural sector, and that's directly related to why we're here. So thank you for having us. And during this harvest season with agriculture and changing laws, it's a really nice time to be here and provide outreach services for your community.
Yeah, and again, thank you both for coming on. And that, one of my goals, some of our Farm Bureau people have heard before, I used to work at the department, and I'm a big advocate for your outreach and education services. And again, thank you, both of you, for coming on today to help share your knowledge and help educate our industry on just sort of process, how things get implemented. And again, thank you very much.
Well, again, just to echo that, I appreciate you both being a part of the conversation. And that really is the goal of this, is to be a conversation. So I'll kind of start us off, maybe tee us up with a question here, but really we'll just kind of take it from there and let's see where it goes. But let's talk about the kind of this law implementation or the administrative policy process. Like was mentioned with this 2020 legislative session ending in April, there were several new pieces of legislation that the agricultural employers and employees we've all been watching. We'll explore a couple of those in this conversation, but perhaps the biggest one that Farm Bureau members have been watching this session is this SB 5172, and that was the ag overtime bill that passed the legislature. The governor recently signed it. Now that it's been signed into law, L&I gets the task of implementing and enforcing the new law, including this developing it into executable policy. So kind of before we dive into the details of what these policies might look like, can you walk me through a little bit of the process of developing policies around a newly signed law? So the governor signs the bill. Now what?
Absolutely. Good question. So now, as you mentioned, now that the legislative session is kind of wrapped up, the governor has signed certain bills into existence. As we look at implementing these new laws, we often either update or create brand new policies to help provide additional interpretive guidance around these new laws.
Okay.
So as far as the agricultural overtime bill that passed, our program is already reviewing our existing policies that we have in place to see what might need to be updated. A lot of our policies currently say agricultural employees aren't entitled to overtime, which obviously that is now changing.
Sure.
And we're also looking to kind of evaluate whether we might want to develop any brand new policies to provide additional guidance on how to comply with the new law. The statute itself provides a pretty good framework for making sure that agricultural workers are eligible for overtime pay. But there's a lot of questions that come along with that. And that's what our administrative policies kind of aim to do. We try and help answer the questions that arise from new laws. So, for example, one question that we've been asked a lot already is, how do employers calculate the overtime pay rate for workers who are paid on a piece rate basis? So that's one of the types of questions that we're going to try and answer in our policy development efforts.
So now what's the timeline that we're looking at for these policies to be finalized and implemented and executed? Is it something that's immediate, or is this going to take something that'll kind of over time be dialed in?
Yeah, it will take us some time to finalize any new policies that we create and update our existing policies. Our goal right now is to release a first draft of these administrative policies by the end of July for public comment. Depending on the amount of feedback we get on those draft policies, we may choose to release a second draft to get additional feedback. But our goal is to approve final policies by the end of the year because we really want to have them in place before portions of this new law take effect on January 1st, 2022.
Okay. Now, you mentioned feedback. So employers that might be having concerns or maybe scenarios that they've heard about this, how can they provide feedback? How can they present their concerns or before this new policy is implemented?
Yeah, great question. So there's going to be multiple opportunities for both employers and employees to express their views through the policy development process. People will be able to submit written comments to the program after we release the draft to the program's engagement website. And we're also going to hold public input sessions where people can come and listen in and have a dialogue and share their thoughts about our draft policies. We are going to have to wait and see if these will be all virtual public input sessions or if we'll be able to include any in-person opportunities as the state starts opening back up a little bit.
Well, that kind of gives a little bit of clarity just as far as the process goes. But now we can kind of dive a little bit into some of the nitty gritty, I guess. Talk about the details of the new requirements around overtime in agriculture. So farmers, they want to be in compliance. They want to protect their operations. So kind of give us, what should they be aware of? What should they be aware of? What should they be looking at? What information or knowledge should they have? What should they be looking forward to regarding this new law?
Yeah, and that's why we're here. There's a lot of technical questions that each farmer will present that represents their unique circumstances with their businesses. So some things to keep in mind is that the law will take effect on July 25th, 2021. This date is 90 days after the end of the legislative session, but some portions of the law will be phased in with the phase-in schedule, and that's a term that you're going to hear pretty often with these agricultural overtime changes. And to really break it down, starting July 25th, 2021, dairy workers will be eligible for overtime compensation for all hours worked over 40 hours in a work week. And then beginning January 1st, 2022, so beginning of the new year, all other agricultural workers will be eligible for overtime compensation for their hours worked. And this would be with the phase-in schedule. So starting January, it would be overtime for 55 hours in a work week. As time progresses, the phase-in schedule will change as well. So then beginning January 1st, 2023, that overtime threshold would be 48 hours. And then finally on January 1st, 2024, the overtime threshold will be 40 hours. And essentially, the agricultural overtime exemption is removed from the Minimum Wage Act as of January 1st, 2022.
So, Cristina, just to also be clear, too, with those dairy workers, you were saying, what was the date there? July 25th of this year here, so just within a month or so. Mm-hmm. And that one, the threshold is not a phased in. Is that correct? It starts right at 40 hours?
Exactly, yeah.
Now, can employers limit an employee's hours to 40 hours per week or whatever the current threshold is? Is that what they should be doing?
Well, yes, employers can choose the number of hours employees are scheduled to work, and are not required to offer overtime hours. And that would be for the dairy workers.
Great. And so there, I think the clarification is, an employer, it's their business. They have a right to choose the work schedule, right? Other than, and Cristina or can correct me if I'm wrong, but if you're employing minors or something, then there are some limitations to when people can work. But for adults, they can say, hey, you're working 20 hours, you're working 80 hours, you're working 40 hours.
Yeah. So,
an employer would have the option to decide for their business needs how many hours they want an individual employee to work.
Absolutely, yes. The law isn't specifying whether or not the employees must get overtime hours, but it does say, when they need to be compensated that premium rate if they work over a certain number of hours per work week.
So then that's a good one, because then that leads sort of into the next questions, because you're going to get some employees that are used to historically working, say, 55 hours, 60 hours in a work week, especially this time of year, right, as we're ramping up in the various commodities across our state. If an employer says, you know what, I'm capping your hours during the work week at 40 hours, the employee chooses to work more, they've not been authorized, is an employer going to be required to pay that overtime for those additional hours if that worker's not been authorized? And if so, how might an employer be able to handle that type of a situation so that they're not skirting the law?
Yeah, so in that scenario, if the workers still do the work beyond 40 hours, yes, they would be eligible for overtime pay. So essentially, if the work is performed, it must be paid. And if agricultural or dairy workers do not receive overtime pay that they are entitled to receive under the new law, then they can also file a workers' rights complaint with the Department of Labor and Industries. The Employment Standards program investigates all of those complaints. But essentially, if the work is performed, it must be paid.
Okay, good. And then I'll sort of put on my HR consulting hat that we do with a lot of businesses. And in that case, Christina's right on there. Even though the worker worked outside of that authorized time, if it was actual work performed to benefit the business or work performed, it still needs to be paid at the appropriate rate. But then obviously an employer has the right to implement any sort of corrective actions they want to for violations of company direction or policy and stuff like that. And you would want to work with that employee to correct and coach them up to follow directions. So.
And just for, I guess, clarification purposes, the new law talks about, and we've mentioned it here, it talks about a work week. So can you help define what is the definition of a work week, just to make sure we're all on the same page?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's another term that we hear and say very frequently in the wage and hour world. And we're always happy to clarify that for the communities. Employers can define a work week as any 7 consecutive days beginning on the same day and time every week. If an employer does not define a work week, then it defaults to the calendar week, which would be Sunday through Sunday.
That's good to know. I was not aware an employer can define the work week. But I think I heard the piece, it needs to be a consistent. You can't say, this week it's Sunday to Sunday, next week it's Monday to Monday. You need to have sort of a predictable schedule, right, Cristina?
Oh, definitely. Like, it should be consistent. And once you establish the work week, that would be the way it goes every week, for sure.
Good. Thank you.
Now, let me ask you this question, as this is something that we've heard thrown around numerous times, but what about the idea of an agricultural worker who works on multiple farms? Okay, they don't work more than the allowed threshold for any one particular operation, but their total weekly hours worked on the multiple farms are above the threshold. Are those workers entitled to overtime? There's this idea that several farming operations can coordinate their workforce to share workers between them. What about that?
And before you answer that, I'll throw a little wrinkle on it because it's very common in our agricultural industry. We may have employees that work different, what we'll call legal farming entities that have common ownership.
Right.
But then you may have employees that simply work what we would consider classic working for 2 separate or 3 separate employers in a work week on their own. And so that can be something that is very common within the industry.
Right.
Yeah. And so those scenarios are spot on why we're here. And it's going to be definitely a recurring theme with the guidance that we provide. And they're always good questions to ask because of how relevant it is with agriculture. And essentially for those different scenarios, it's all maybe and it depends. But I'm happy to break it down for the listeners and audiences of this podcast.
Let's take the scenario where you have multiple, what we'll call businesses, but common ownership amongst those businesses.
Yeah. So if an employee works at multiple farms with the same or joint ownership, like you said, and their total hours are above the overtime threshold, in that scenario, the employee would also be entitled to overtime pay for all overtime hours worked. And this would be regardless of which of the farms the overtime work was performed on. On the other hand, if the employee works on multiple farms with separate ownership, as in there is no joint business connections at all between multiple farms, and if their hours do not exceed the overtime threshold at any one farm, then they would not be entitled to overtime pay. And each employer would be responsible for paying the employee straight time for all hours worked on their farm.
Yep.
And I can also give an example. So if an employee were to work 40 hours at Farm A and another 20 hours at Farm B, and there was no same ownership or joint business connections at all, and if that employee were to work at each farm without exceeding the threshold, then the worker would not be eligible for overtime, even though the worker worked a total of 60 hours for unrelated farms. And employers should be, again, careful to understand the joint employment obligations. And this would all be something that relates to what you said. It really depends on the scenario, and it depends on if there is a business connection or not. And some key terms are joint employment. That's something that is a buzzword for these scenarios. And also, again, we're happy to provide more guidance. It's always a case-by-case basis, but that's a general idea of how to go about these kinds of scenarios.
Now, and I'll throw just sort of a little nugget of information to the listeners out there. I could potentially, if you're considering limiting hours and you say, hey, our work week is going to always be Monday through Thursday and we're never going to work over 40 hours and my employees go off and work elsewhere, farm down the road, my neighboring farm, I could see some red flags being raised if you and another business, while you're not common owners, are discussing work schedules with each other. I could see that raising potentially some red flags for the department, and you now skirting the line of joint employment, even though you're paying everybody separately, you're doing all separate work. If you're, I'll throw the word out there, colluding on work schedules. Cristina, correct me if I'm wrong, but I could see that throwing some red flags for the department, correct?
It would be something that we would be able to help clarify when questions come in, and also if workers' rights complaints come in and they file a workers' complaint form, then we would investigate any scenario and move forward in that kind of individualized way.
I do think it's a great point that ownership on paper is not the only reason we might determine that two farms would have a joint employment relationship. So, co-directing the workforce could be a factor that we look at in trying to determine that. So that, we would really encourage employers to take a look at our joint employment guidance. We do have administrative policies related to that topic that goes through, different factors to look at to evaluate whether or not a joint employment relationship might exist. And like you just pointed out, it's more than just, who's on the business license. So I think that's a great thing to keep in mind. Okay,
that is actually very helpful and kind of clarifies some of that gray area. But kind of along with those individuals, if they do have questions, these resources are on the L&I website, or how is best to get some of these clarifying documents, frequently asked question sheets, things like that?
Yeah, folks can go to L&I's website. So that's www.lni.wa.gov. And there's a workplace rights tab that has a variety of topics that we enforce in the Employment Standards program specifically.
Okay.
And you can find contact information there as well.
Great. Okay.
Well, and another great little resource on that webpage too is if, from the employer's perspective, if you've just got questions, they have a good general employment standards email and a phone number, or they've got staff fielding those types of questions. I'm sure that some of those go to yourself, Cristina, at times to follow up with people asking questions or looking for a document or looking for a policy. And so, if you're not able to find it, I encourage people to submit that type of stuff.
Yeah, our goal is to help folks be proactively in compliance. Of course, part of what we have to do is investigate complaints if employees feel like their rights have been violated. But our goal really is to get proactive compliance. And so we want to be a resource in that. And we really encourage folks, if you have questions, if you have concerns, please reach out to us. We're here to help, and we want to, help you be in compliance.
And I appreciate that. And I know many of our members and listeners would do as well.
Do you want me to jump in on this next one here, Ben? I think this one sort of follows back up with our employees working different operations. So here, let's say we've got a similar employer, but now let's throw a dairy into a wrinkle. So you've got employees that work on a dairy, which we just heard, that overtime's kicking in here at the 40 hours, but then they go and do other work for another part of the business that's, their hay operation, silage, feed, corn, whatnot, and it's not actually the dairy work going on, and it's for a separate part of the business. Have you guys considered at all how that type of a situation might get handled related to are the hours overtime worked or not?
Yeah, so the Department of Labor and Industries is considering scenarios like that. And a scenario like what you just explained is something that we will be providing further guidance on for the Employment Standards Program's policy updates, because they are getting to the technical side of what happens in these unique circumstances. This is something that we are definitely dedicating our time and guidance for the administrative policy updates, which Ellen mentioned how that goes earlier. And those updates essentially are us looking for public feedback and having this open communication with how to develop guidance and what questions are very thematic with current updates with agricultural overtime changes.
Good. And I would recommend employers out there, if you're not already, this is a really good time to sharpen up your record keeping, meaning not just Ben here worked 8 hours for us, but you might want to get some additional notes. What type of work were they doing? What business did I have them working at? And make sure, adding some of that additional detail now, building in ways to document that could assist you later as these policies are rolling out.
Yeah. And then the nice thing about the Washington Farm Bureau is when you notice that your members have these types of questions that relate to how to track hours with these unique circumstances with different duties, we're definitely looking at any kind of way to get that feedback from the agricultural sector. And I think that having a membership or being a member and having the Washington Farm Bureau be very